So thank you very much, Akain, and thank you very much to all of you for being here in this talk, helping me with my research. I hope you find it interesting. So I'm going to be talking today about first-person representation, so something that some, at least, probably many of you have been working, or at least heard about. And I'm going to be talking about the role that it might play, or I'm going to defend that it does play, in explaining or characterizing consciousness. Here is what I intend to do in this talk. I'm going to try to offer a solution of the demarcation problem in the representational terms. What is the demarcation problem? So it's just the problem of deciding what is the kind of thing that distinguishes conscious states from unconscious states. So when we start processing visual signal, at some point, so the signal in the retina, we don't think that those are the kind of states that are conscious. Now, the kind of state, I'm looking now at my computer, is a conscious state, so at some point, consciousness arises. I'm going to be saying a little bit more about consciousness. So the demarcation problem is the problem of deciding at which point consciousness arises. And I'm going to do so in representational terms. So rather than appealing to some sort of function on top of the representational properties, I'm going to try to explain just in pure representational terms. That requires that there is some kind of representation which we do not hold unconsciously. This requires to argue that something beyond the primary object is conveyed by the experience. So what I mean by the primary object of experience is clear in the case of perception. So look at my hand. Now the hand is the primary object of perception. So when we are looking around, there are like many objects. Those are the primary object of experience. I'm considering a very simple experience, like the one you might have when looking at a red apple. The apple and its properties is what I'm going to be calling the primary object of experience. That will become more clear later. So I'm going to argue that characterizing conscious states in representational terms is going to require first-person representation. I will clarify what I mean by first-person representation, etc., etc. And then what I actually will do is characterize the kind of first-person representation that is required, what I'm going to be calling core desert representation. And then what I'm going to conclude by vindicating the need of a metasemantic theory of the set representation. What do I mean by a metasemantic theory? A theory that explains what is required from a system in order to have this kind of representation. So that's what I intend to do in this talk. In order to do so, here's how the talk is going to be organized. I'll first present shortly this idea of consciousness and the relation between consciousness and representation, and then I will move to what is conveyed by the experience. So the representationalist project starts by what is conveyed by the experience, try to explain that in representational terms, then characterize what is required in order to have this kind of experience, and that's the job done. And then I'm going to be discuss whether the experience conveys something about beyond the primary object of experience, about the subject herself or the experience itself. And I'm going to argue that the experience concerns the subject but not the experience. Short comment on what I mean by concern. The term concern is borrowed from John Perry, but my use is might be slightly different. So what I mean when I say that the experience concerns the subject, all that I mean is that the subject is part of the correctness conditions of the state. So for those familiar with Perry, it depends on who reads that, and we can discuss that. He intends to make some finer distinctions. All that I mean here is that it's part of the correctness conditions. What I intend to do with that, I intend to be neutral on whether the subject is part of the content or contributes to the correctness conditions by other means. So I intend to be neutral on different views, different semantic views with regard to first-person representation. But I will clarify all of that in the sequel. So I will try to justify that, characterize what I mean by what are the characteristics of core the self-representation, and then deal with some objections. Then I will deny that the experience concerns itself and conclude. So let's start. Here's the initial assumption. So I hope you, by consciousness, I mean phenomenal consciousness. So I'm interested in the kind of states we are in, I hope we all are in, when we're looking at a computer, when we hear music, when we have a pain, or when we have an orgasm. There is something it is like for us to be in those states, and I'm worried about the nature of those states. I want to try to understand those. So by phenomenally conscious states, that's the kind of states we are in when we're having a conscious experience. And then here is what I take to be an uncontroversial claim. Undergoing experience E is just a matter of being in what I'm going to be calling a phenomenally conscious state, where the state here is to be taken as an umbrella term to allow for processes, events, etc., etc. So now a theory of consciousness attempts to find out what are the properties that individuate this kind of phenomenally conscious states, right? To question. So what distinguishes different kind of the kind of states I'm in when I'm having different kind of experience? What distinguishes the kind of state I'm in when I'm having an orgasm from the one that I have when I'm looking at a red apple? But also what all those states have in common in such a way that they are to be distinguished from other kind of states, like allegedly the ones that this table might have. And this is what I call the demarcation problem. Is the problem of determining what distinguishes phenomenally conscious states from other kind of states, right? Now, here's one. I mean, we're all philosophers, but when we're presenting that, it's like, look, this is something that it's going to depend probably on my brain, on certain neural activity. So why don't we go directly and ask a neurologist or a psychologist? They identified whatever neural network is required, and then job done. Well, at the very least, there are some issues. At the very least, and we will see more. So imagine that I find out what is the neural correlate of my red apple experience. So those properties, the properties that these phenomenally conscious states are probably properties that a neural network might have. Depends on some issues. But now, let's assume that this is so. Even if I were able to identify this neural correlate, I don't want to make an identification with the whole neural correlate. So there are some properties that this state has, which might not be relevant to consciousness. For example, this piece of brain is gray. Is the property of being gray one of the properties that is relevant to have an orgasm? Probably not. But how do we decide which properties are relevant and which ones are not? So if we want to claim that it is one of them, then most probably we want to go all the way down to the very constituents of those states, so like the fundamental particles, and we will end up with something like some form of panpsychism, or we find out a criterion, like a function or a structure that allows us to pick up some properties but not others. And the question is how we do that. So here is representationalism. Representationalism is a way considered as a materialistic friendly theory that might help us to do so. And the idea is the following. So when we're having an experience, one is aware of the environment, our states, and ourself. So our experience conveys something about the world and ourselves. So when we're seeing a red apple, our experience conveys at the very least that there is something like that there is a red apple. And then what does the representationalist do? So the representationalist attempts to unpack this such an awareness in representational terms. So to be aware that such and such is the case is a matter of representing that such and such is the case. Now, then if we say that there is nothing to say about the experience beyond the fact that it conveys something and how this is possible, then we end up with the conclusion that phenomenally conscious states are representational states. This might be plausible or sufficiently plausible when we talk about perception. It is less clear when we consider other kind of experiences like pain or orgasms or moods, right? The representationists have different tools, like appealing to other forms of representation, like imperative content, etc., but it's not so clear that they will succeed. I just assume and play within this framework, that this is something that can be solved, and focus for illustration in the cases that are more sympathetic to make my case, like perception, okay? But I acknowledge this worry. So then, once we have done that, a theory of mental content, what I have been calling a metasemantic theory, help us to determine which are the properties relevant to perform the required representation. So a theory of mental content would then tell me what is required from a system in order to have this kind of representation, and thereby to have a conscious experience. So this way we can find out the properties that individuate phenomenally conscious states. Now, some people, like first-order representationists, did with them, people like Fred Dretske or Michael Tai, started by, oh, what is the kind of thing, what is what my experience conveys? And say, well, when you're looking at the red apple, it merely conveys something about the environment, so about the red, about the red apple. The problem that this view has, phenomenology aside, is that if there are unconscious representation of these features of the environment, then they fail to characterize PCS. So they only consider what I've been calling the primary object of experience. Another footnote, there are interesting discussions on what exactly is the primary object of experience. So when I'm representing the red apple, what kind of properties are part of the correctness conditions, whether those are properties like only form or color, or also properties like that of being an apple, so higher order properties. There are also discussions on whether this is some form of abstract property or singular ones. I'm not entering this discussion, and I'm worried about what is conveyed by the experience beyond this primary object of experience. So that said, independently of what those properties are, we seem to have good reasons to think that those properties are represented unconsciously. So if we think that those are colors, for example, or forms, we do represent those unconsciously. But in that case, we do not have a criterion to solve the demarcation problem. So we need to appeal to something over and above the representation to distinguish what are the conscious states and the unconscious states. What can we do? Well, here's one option. We offer a functional characterization. We appeal to a functional role in order to distinguish the phenomenally conscious states from those that are non-phenomenally consciousness. Well, there are some issues. So this is like less appealing because the connection between this function and the phenomenology is less clear. It's like, whatever function do you bring in, it's like, why should I pick that one? But there are at least some notions that might be sufficiently justified. Here's one, like the idea, oh, you know, when I'm having an experience, I notice it. So then there are this notion like poise or availability to report and belief formation, or being encoded in what the Han and colleagues call the global workspace, a system that makes the information available to other processes. And then the difference, one might say, oh, you know, the difference is like those representations, phenomenally conscious states are those representational states whose content is available to other processes. Or one can point out to attention, as Jesse have done. Well, this is not what I'm going to do this day. I think that those options are false for empirical reasons. So I think that we have empirical evidence against the claim that the global workspace or attention is constitutive of phenomenology, of phenomenally conscious states, but I'm just going to follow a different strategy today, okay? Here's the alternative. So claim that something over and above this primary object of perception is conveyed in experience, and here now I'm doing this trick of focusing on perception. I have already excused myself for doing so and being a little bit tricky. I hope that you let me play. And then characterize such a representation. so what is that is conveyed beyond this primary object of experience, and then deny that in the presence of this kind of representation, we fail to have the corresponding experience. Okay? So in this case, I attempt to explain the difference between conscious and unconscious states in pure representational terms. That's what I attempt to do. Now, if we follow the representational project, we need to focus on what the experience conveyed, what the experience represents. And the idea that something over and above the primary object of experience is conveyed by the experience can be traced back to Aristotle. But I think that Brentano is the philosopher that became famous for bringing Aristotle back to the discussion. Here are a couple of quotes where Brentano says, every conscious act includes within a consciousness of itself. So it conveys also its own presence. Therefore, every conscious act, no matter how simple, has a double object, a primary and a secondary object. The simplest act, for example, the act of hearing, has as its primary object the sound, and for its secondary object itself, the mental phenomenon in which the sound is heard. So he's pointing out here, in this quote, that there is, beyond the primary object of experience, there's something on top of that, which is the experience itself, which is also represented. And here is another quote saying, the mentally active subject has himself as an object of secondary reference, regardless of what else he refers to as his primary object. So here we have two candidates. One is the experience itself, and one is the subject. So here is something that Brentano is pointing out. I'm going to avoid saying that the experience itself is an object of representation, or that the subject is an object of representation. That will be far more clear when I spell out what I think that is required for the experience and when I give the motivation. So, but here, all that I wanted to take from this is that the experience conveys something that goes beyond the primary object of experience. In the intending to be neutral terms that I use, what I take is that the experience can concern the representation, the experience itself, or the subject herself. So, according to this, we can consider the following four options. So, we can say that the experience is the kind of experience that you have when you're looking at a red apple, conveys something just about the apple and its properties. And that's the options that I'm not discussing today, because we have seen that then we require something functional over and above that if we represent this thing unconsciously. Okay? Second alternative is saying, beyond the primary object of experience, the experience also conveyed something about itself. So the experience conveys something just about the apple and its properties and the experience itself, or merely about the experience itself, depending what we take to be the primary object of experience. If we go more like Humean, then the primary object of experience would not be properties of the apple, but rather properties in the mind, which might be properties that the experience instantiate. And as I'm not making a big claim with regard to what the primary object of experience, and I think that we can easily move from one position to the other. I hope that this is clear. So here's only the primary object of experience, here's the primary object of experience, and the experience itself. Option 3 is the experience conveyed that one herself is in a state that relates oneself to the apple and its properties. So in this case, the experience concerns the primary object of experience and the subject of experience, but not the experience itself. And fourth is that the experience conveyed that one herself is having the experience, and then the experience relates one to the primary object of experience. So the difference, here's only the subject and the primary object, here's only the experience, and here are both, okay? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to argue that 3 is the case. So that goes against 2, and then argue in the second part that there is no good reason to accept that the experience has to represent itself. That's the way. And that way I'm going to favor option 3. Okay? So then the first step would be Does the experience concern the subject? How can we justify this claim? So it might be a priori reasoning. So when Nagel presented this idea of what it is like, he highlighted the fact that in having an experience, there is something that is like for the subject to be in that state. So the very same idea of this phenomenology, of this phenomenally conscious experience, when it was presented, it mentions the subject, right? Well, I'm not sure about that, this expression, and actually it's like Alex Byrne saying, I mean, we can intelligibly and literally wonder what it is like for our car to be driven in the desert, right? But if we can do that without appealing to assuming that there is any phenomenology in the car, if this makes sense, then a priori reasoning seems not to be the way to go. But there are some people that have them to do that. I'm just not confident that this is going to convince some of you. If you're happy, then okay, terrific. But I don't think that this is the way to go. So one might also think in something like it's quasi a priori reasoning based on false psychology. And here's this David Rosenthal transitivity principle, where he claims that a conscious state is one that I am aware of myself as being. So I need, whenever that I'm conscious, whenever that I have a conscious experience, I am conscious that I am conscious. And that might be okay, because he claims, in no sense a state that we're not aware of ourselves as being at all could count as a conscious state. And that's like, that's fine. So it's like, might be acceptable, but the question is, how do we justify? So it might be part of our false psychology, but we need a justification of our false psychology. The question is, so our false psychology is a set of beliefs and ideas, and they have to be justified. And the idea is, in this particular claim, what justifies this false psychological claim? Is it a priori reasoning? Is it empirical investigation? It's not clear to me that there is going to be any empirical evidence. So I think that is phenomenology itself. So phenomenological reflection. Here's one problem. When it comes to phenomenology and we have to say something about phenomenology, things get really swampy, right? So it's extremely difficult to have discussions about phenomenology, especially when one tries to do things like carefully and clearly and giving reasons. And I can just present some examples. So, and your opponent is going to say, no, I don't have it. What can we do in this situation? So it's like, oh, maybe your experience does not have this feature, or maybe we can discuss on which of us is a better introspector or can reflect better in their own experience. But that seems to be no way to go. So what I'm going to do, and I hope that this is helpful, and you can, at the end, let me know how successful our work is. I try to motivate this claim. How do I do so? By explaining what I mean by that, okay? And by giving you examples, and by appealing to, in the paper, I add many quotes from many people from different fields. And this is not intended to be as something like an authoritative argument, but just different ways in which the idea can be presented. I'm completely sure that it's not going to be convincing by all of you. And then I'm going to spell out what I mean when I say that something about the subject. And then, for those who fail to appreciate the feature, I'm going to try to show what is the mistake that they are doing. And maybe in doing so, they can be, oh, if you mean something like that, then I'm happy. Okay? That's going to be my strategy. Okay. So here's the starting point. So that's just me. So, man, when I'm looking at a red apple, my experience does not merely convey something about the apple. So does not only say that the apple is there. It conveys how am I related to the apple. It conveys that I am perceptually or otherwise related to the apple. So it says something not only about how the world is, but also about myself. This idea has been captured by some other philosophers, like saying that all conscious experience have in common their First personal character, sometimes pointed out as a quality of for me-ness or me-isness. Zahavi and Kriegel say, to say that an experience is for me is precisely to say something more than it happens in me as the beating of my heart. It's to state not only a metaphysical fact that it happened, but also a phenomenological fact. So this idea is captured in the phenomenological tradition, by what is known as pre-reflective self-consciousness. Here Gallagher and Zahavi, in a long quote, not perfectly well written, but he pointed out that there is something it is like to taste chocolate, smell vanilla, blah, 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 blah. Just at the same time, as I live through this difference, there is something experiential that is in some sense the same. They're distinct first personal character. All the experiences are characterized by the quality of me-ness or for me-ness, by the fact that it's I who am having this experience. All experiences are given, at least tacitly, wow, tacitly, what the heck is that? We will see. As my experiences, as experiences I am undergoing or living through. All this suggests that first-person experience present me with an immediate and non-observational access to myself, and that consequently, phenomenal consciousness entails a minimal form of self-consciousness. So claims along the lines of that have been presented by people like Barthes in science, like in neuroscience by people like Pollen or Pebble or Damasio, etc., etc. But the idea here is something about myself as a subject, and we will see that, is conveyed by the experience. Here, in this quote, also about the experience itself. So I'll have more to say about that later. So an experience, indexically, and I'm going to also to clarify this idea, concerns its subject. So let's characterize these things. So, of course, there is, when I say that the experience concerns the subject, there is an obvious difference between the primary object of experience and what is conveyed beyond that. So there is a difference in the sense in which the apple or the properties of the apple are conveyed and the subject. And it doesn't seem, so the experience, so Sebas' experience does, at least my experience, does not seem to convey that Sebas is in such and such state. One of the reasons to think so is like, well, I have the intuition, and not only an intuition, but this seems to fall also from our behavior, and I'm confident that you shared that with me, that the very same kind of experience that I have is one that you can have, in principle. Maybe not, but in principle. So now, if my experience represents that Sebas is doing the experience, unless you're looking at me or I'm the primary object of your experience would very difficultly represent anything about Sebas. So when you're looking at an apple, your experience does not convey anything about Sebas. So difference in, if we assume something like that, first of all, different individuals could not have experience of the same kind, phenomenologically individuated. Actually, what my experience does not convey that Sebas is in such and such when I happen to be Sebas. It rather conveys that I myself am in such state. So the kind of representation that characterizes this experience is DC, what John Perry and David Lewis call DC. So this is the first. This is what we can call indexicality, or first characterization is a DC representation, but there are different kinds. So DC representations are rich, and I want to narrow down some features of the kind of representation that I'm postulating, what I'm going to be calling core DC representation. So the second feature is that the subject is part of the correctness conditions, or is represented as a subject rather than as an object. So Wittgenstein, so Shoemaker following Wittgenstein claim that some DC representations are immune to error. So when I'm having a headache, so typically the kind of beliefs one come to have on the basis directly on the basis of experience, like my belief that I'm having a headache based on the headache on my painful experience is immune to error. What does it mean? That we can contrast this with the one that I might acquire when I'm looking at a mirror and I see a guy with a cast in his arms, and I come to believe I have a cast in my arm. So in the first case, in the second case, we can ask, are you sure it's you, the one that you're seeing in the mirror? In the first case, And you say, probably, yeah, I'm pretty sure. So the guy looks very much like me, and I'm in front of a mirror, but it makes sense. So when you ask me, are you sure it's you the one that is paying? It's like, what the heck are you saying? So in this sense, it doesn't seem that we cannot fail in this sense, and Shoemaker claimed that those are immune to error, to misidentification relative to the first person pronoun. He also claimed that not all the set representations can be representations as object. So in that sense, and I'm not going to enter into the details, but representation as a subject is more fundamental. I want to add something like the following. I want to add that it is due to the nature of the state that it has to be evaluated, so that the subject is part of the correctness conditions. Why this is so? Because I want it to be, it's because there is something in the state that distinguishes that state from other kind of states. And what I'm having in mind is like what Perry calls the case of an unarticulated constituent. So he thinks that when I believe that it's raining, although this state has to be evaluated with regard to certain location, it might be the case that the here is not just an elliptic element in the language, but it's rather something that does not even appear in the mind. Okay? And he presents a radical case, so in our case it might be doubtful, but he thinks okay, so there is a property of the vehicle of representation has, in virtue of which it has to be indexically evaluated with respect to the bearer of the state. So what I want to avoid is those cases of what Perry calls an unarticulated constituents. So he imagined this case of people who lives in an isolated place, and they never travel to another place, and they never interact with other people, and when they believe or they claim that it's raining, there is no need for them to represent in any sense. There has to be anything in their mind that makes the state evaluable with regard to the location. Now we know that it has to be, so it might rain here, but not there. It's just a contingent fact that there are different locations in the actual world, what makes it evaluable, that has to be evaluated with regard to the location. So I want to avoid, this is an ad hoc claim in order to avoid those cases, because I want something to be something in the state such that it can make the distinction, in virtue of which we can have a distinction between conscious and unconscious states. So finally, I think that something can be represented in our experience even if we lack the corresponding concept. So a system, I will give you a certainly complicated sentence, and I want to claim that the state has to be, can have this correctness condition. I need a sentence to express those correctness conditions, but I don't intend to claim that an individual need to have those concepts in order to have this kind of representation. So this is what Heck called state non-conceptualism. So a core de ser representation is a representation that does not involve the possession of the corresponding concept by the subject, that due to the nature of the state has to be evaluated not only with regard to the way the world is, but also with regard to the very individual that is doing the representation as such. And that cannot be evaluated with respect to any other entity. I was very quick because I was just summarizing the previous point. So it's like, it has to be indexically evaluated. There is something there that makes it evaluable with regard to the subject, respect immunity to error, and does not involve the possession of the concept. That's why I speed up just for a second, because it was just a summary of the things that I have considered before.
Is that a representational state or core de ser representation?
It's core de ser representation. I'm going to call this kind of representational states core de ser representationals to mark a particular kind of de ser representations. So I'm not claiming that any de ser representation is a conscious state, only that those particular kinds are de ser representations, okay? Now, some objections. So the first one would be, man, this is too demanding. Oh, this is like, if you're demanding that, you're demanding too much. But that's an unfair objection. So that will depend on a metasemantic theory, on a theory that spells out what is required from a system in order to represent oneself in the way that I'm saying that it's represented. Okay? So that's in the absence of a what I have called a metasemantic theory, this objection does not go through. Second, but this, if it represents self, it commits to some kind of weird entity, the self. Well, again, that depends on what it takes to represent what self, but representing the self-representation is not a matter of representing a particular entity which we all represent or something like that, okay? So this, on the other hand, it's like, okay, it's too strong, but all can claim, oh, but it's too weak, because we, for example, have unconscious desert beliefs. And I say, yeah, but that's a conceptual desert representation. I'm making a claim about non-conceptual. So this is not a form of core desert representation. An interesting case is like, but we do have, so look into science. I mean, science tells us that we have in vision unconscious egocentric representations, right? Well, that's what I'm going to be called at the Hinge representation, not at the set representation. So in vision, we do represent, so we have what I call egocentric representations and allocentric representations. Allocentric representations represent the location of objects with regard to each other. Egocentric representations represent the position of the object with regard to a certain location, namely, typically the point here between the eyes. So those representations have to be evaluated with regard to a location. So we would use a here rather than I or a me in order to evaluate. So there is nothing first person in those representations. Okay? So, and I'm going to skip the case of episodic memory and maybe come back to that in the Q&A. So here's what I think to really be an objection. And probably those of you who are not with me at this point is like, man, I'm not getting that. I'm not getting this first thing. And here's one way to spell out. Here's Hume, who's famously claimed whenever that you teach something on self-consciousness, you have to put this quote. It's like one of these things, like copy and copy. Here again, it's like when I look more deeply into what I call myself, I don't recall it, but it's like I don't find anything but the perception. There might be many things. So he's unable to find himself in the experience. So in introspection, we fail to find ourselves. And it's supposed to be there somehow. What's going on? Okay? And it doesn't seem to be that it's something ubiquitous, that it's in every experience, as I'm claiming. Because he could be, I mean, Hume is typically able to find ubiquitous features. So that might not be. So he has to make a different mistake. So if I tell you, you cannot find it because it's in every experience, you say, man, I typically can do that. So when we, in phenomenological discussion, when somebody is not able to do something, we cannot say, oh, you cannot do that, which you typically can do, okay? So it has to be something different. So what's the problem? So what is Hume and Prince who takes this radical position? I'm not sure whether Hume took that position. It's like, so the content, think of the content of your perceptual representation. So look at the features here. You see my cell phone and you see the computer, and your experience would represent the, you would express this representation as saying that the computer is to the right of the computer from here, from the location. So it's at the Hinge, what I have called at the Hinge representation. Okay. Now, right, that's not controversial, okay? So your experience to be indexically evaluated with regard to a location. Now, would you be so kind as to please introspect the here-ness of your experience? So it's somehow, I mean, you do not doubt that your experience represented from here. So that's part of the correctness condition. So what I'm claiming is that oneself is like the here-ness. So when you introspect, it's like, I mean, it's there, but it's not something that I have to find there. So it's not an object. Okay, I have like 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So what about the experience itself? So if consciousness, if we consider case 2, then for the same reasons, the representational content would have to be the mentis, namely evaluable with regard to the experience itself, but I'm ignoring that. So as I have already claimed that the subject is necessary, so the representation of the subject is necessary, this claim is less clear to me, and we don't need to do that if we accept that consciousness entails what I have called core-desert representation. So the question now is like, is there any good reason to claim that the experience has to also represent itself? Okay. There are not many arguments. One that is famously due to Sartre, and we can find it also in the Buddhist tradition, and it's the idea that in having the experience, I can immediately tell you what I'm doing. So in the example of Sartre, it's like if I'm counting cigarettes, so the primary object is the cigarettes, but also the counting is non-thetically in his term also there. And if you ask me, I can immediately and not reflectively tell you that what I'm doing. So here's Sahabi. It says this, it's because I'm pre-reflectively conscious, pre-reflectively intends to capture this elusive thing that I'm of my experience that I'm usually able to respond immediately. I'm usually able to respond immediately that without inference of observation. If somebody asks me what I'm doing or thinking or seeing or feeling immediately prior to that question. So one problem is that phenomenological data cannot be logically inferred from an epistemological relation. So we cannot infer from the fact that I am in a position to immediately tell you what I'm doing that there has to be something phenomenologically manifest. And in reply, actually, Sahabi and Kriegel acknowledge that, and they claim that it's not a logical argument, but it's rather an inference to the best explanation. So it would be nice, but not necessary, that the representational properties of the phenomenally conscious state explain our epistemological relation. Okay? Now, of course, then I can definitely tell you what I'm doing, because I'm part of the correctness condition. So, but do we have to hold that consciousness conveys its own presence to explain the data? I think that we don't. So imagine that you're listening to the riff of Bohemian Rhapsody. The example is previous to the film, a couple of years already. So if asked, what are you doing, you would immediately and effortlessly report something that you're listening to music. That's fine. And this is what it's intended to be. But then the only thing that I have to represent in the experience is that I'm hearing music. So, and if hearing music is a different state from the experience of hearing music, right? So for example, because the experience of hearing music is at a state that, say, represents that I am hearing music, and hearing music is a relation to the music, then we don't need, in order to explain the data, there is no need to claim that the experience has to represent itself. As I don't have time, there is another thing that I am considering, that it comes from two different uses of consciousness, but I prefer to conclude so that we have I can have the help of your questions. So I have, just to conclude in 1 minute, I have argued that experience represents its subject, but not the experience itself. Now, here's the problem. So we have metasemantic theories of third-person representations, and they typically exploit things like biological function and information relations, like Millikan, Papineau, Neander, Sea, etc., etc. So, but this, if Perry and Lewis are right, is insufficient to characterize first-person representation. So we need also to characterize, in Perry's term, the kind of state I'm in, so the difference. And that's not something given by those cases. Or in Lewis' parlance, we would have, we can come to possible world representation, but not to center world representation. That is what's here required. Now, there are some theories, like, for example, Recanati or Peacock. But those theories depend on consciousness. So they explain first-person representation in terms of consciousness. So just to mention an example, in Recanati's case, he thinks that the subject is not part of the content, but rather of the manner of the mode of representation. And it's the mode of representation what guarantees that it has and can only be evaluated with regard to the subject. But this mode of representation in this particular case is what he calls the experiential mode. So he grounds first-person representation on experience. And the same goes with Peacock. So this is not something valid for our purpose. Millikan has also famously argued that it's not a problem. So first-person representation is not a problem for his theory, but she gives up indexicality. And if we need indexicality, then that's not the way to go. So we need a metasemantic theory of the self-representation that does not depend on consciousness if we want the representational project to succeed. And that's it. Thank you very much. Okay. Sorry, that's a bit long.
It will help me to understand your view. So how would you deal, maybe it's relevant for the first person thing, for the knowledge, the case of Perry's case of Mark and the shabby pedagogue. So Ernst Mach gets into a bus and there's a mirror at the back of the bus and he sees himself, but he doesn't recognize himself. So he thinks, oh, that's a shabby pedagogue, this is all dirty.
Yeah.
So in a sense, he's having a representation of himself, because he's thinking about himself. But in another sense, he's not, because he's not realizing that he is the shabby pedagogue. So there's a kind of a different statement. Oh, I am, and then you go out and clean your. He went out and cleaned himself. So how would you? Because it seems like he will say that there is a. In the second case, there is a desired representation. In the first case, there is no.
And I totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We just say, well, but.
So in this case, the image. Let's just note that it's the image. So imagine that I'm looking at myself in a mirror, and I do not recognize, or even if I recognize myself, it's the very same case. So Sebas is the primary object of experience. So that's not a desert representation by no means. What is represented is Sebas. Okay? So I love using but I didn't know what I was going to paint. So in this case, Sebas is the primary object of experience. Okay? Now, Sebas can be consciously and unconsciously represented. Okay? In my experience and also in yours. So you can represent Sebas when you look at me, and I can represent Sebas visually when I look at myself in a mirror, right? But that's not a desert representation. It's an object represented there, and that's all. Now, what happens when consciousness comes into play? So that I come to represent that I myself am visually related to Sebas. Now, on top of that, if I know that Sebas is me, I would come to believe that I am visually related to myself. But that's an extra point. That's something that happens in thought. What I want to spell out is the difference that there are between having an unconscious representation of Sebas, having by Sebas, and a conscious representation by Sebas.
You would say that Mark in the first case is having an unconscious representation?
No, he has a conscious representation of himself, but not
he doesn't know that.
But not a desert representation of himself. Okay. So Sebas can be represented. So Sebas can indexically represent Sebas and non-indexically represent Sebas. You all you can indexically represent. I'm not sure how I like the use of the terms, but I hope that at least you can follow what I'm saying and then help me to express that in a better way. Mm-hmm. So we all can consciously and unconsciously represent Sebas. All that is required is that you look at me and something happens. What happened in those cases? Maria would have a representation that says that she herself is looking at Sebas. What happened when I look? I look at myself. Okay, and then in this case, I would also have a representation that said, I myself am looking at Sebas. So Sebas is then in these cases is just the primary object. It's like an apple. There is nothing. So the body, this body or whatever, can be a primary object of perception, just as the computer or the apple can be.
Yeah, and just a follow-up and clarification. So when in the first line, what is experience mean? Is just conscious or unconscious?
By experience, I mean Yeah, by experience I mean always conscious experience. So experience always means conscious experience.
And its subject means there, following the example that Maria was using?
So that to say that it represents the subject means that the subject is part of the correctness condition. So take a framework like, let's consider a framework I typically use to illustrate that, which is the Stalnackerian framework. Okay, according to the Stalnackerian or Lewisian framework, third-person representations determine partitions among possible worlds. So they distinguish a set of possible worlds or functions from worlds to truth value. Okay, this is a third-person representation. So they like to represent that. This is the space of possibilities. Here are different ways the world might be, and my representation that there is computer on the table distinguish those worlds in which there is a telephone on the table from those worlds in which there are not. Okay, how this can be done? Millie can come and say, oh, because you have a state that has the function to indicate black square things and so on and so forth. So we need to come from this scenario. Now, when we have the set representations, the kind of partitions that they make is not partitions among possible worlds, but they divide the world among possible worlds, namely functions from worlds and individuals, subjects, to truth value. Okay. So now, when I'm having an experience, well, it's with belief. When I believe that I'm Basque, and a kind belief that I'm Basque, we determine the very same function. So it's only that when you introduce here a kind, you get truth. When you introduce here in the actual world, when you introduce here Sebas, you get false. Or self-ascription. So when I'm self-attributing the property of being Basque, and I don't have it, so it's wrong. And when a kind does this self-attribution, then this is right. I mean, that might be used to explain the difference. So all that I'm trying to capture is the thing that is common to that. If we pick up a framework more sympathetic to Perry, for example, he thinks, no, look, here Lewis would say, oh, the content is the same one. Perry would say, no, the content is different, and what they have in common is a brain state or a mental state, and we need to characterize that. And this kind of thing that is common is the thing that I want to individuate the experience. Okay? So there is a sense in which there is something common is conveyed in your experience and mine. So it's the very same subject, it's me, but it's neutral on whether it's Sebas or it's just I myself, this that's why I need these indexical elements. And I like, here is expressed with the use of a particular semantic framework, and I intend it to be by saying that it's something that is concerned. I intend to be neutral on whether it's part of the content or it's part of the mode of representation or something. I intend, whether I can do it, it's a different issue, because I want to point out to this common element, and mainly because when we figure out metasemantic theory, if we find out that what is required in order to represent this content in the same way or to make this kind of partition is the very same thing, then I don't think that there is any substantial difference, at least insofar as my project conveys. So whether first-person representation is a matter of a relation between a subject and a center world or a center proposition, or a relation between a subject, a classical proposition, and a mode of representation, for example, whether there is a substantial difference for this project in particular will depend on metasemantic theory. And that's why I intend to abstract with this. Does this help to understand the view? No. Okay.
Because there are some different terminologies that we are using. So when you say the experience represents not only the primary object, but something above that, So in that case, so it represents its subject. What does it mean? Is the primary object or a secondary object?
I don't want to call it an object, but it's a secondary object. So the primary object is the apple.
That in that case is, but not the experience.
No, but not the experience. Yeah.
The apple is there.
Yeah. So if I have to use a sentence to express what my visual experience conveys is that I am visually related or that I am seeing the apple. Would express with this sentence: I am seeing the apple. So the one that thinks that it only let's use so here is option 1. It represents so there is an apple, a red apple. Option 2 would be something like this experience tracks or represents the apple. Option 3, that is the one that I'm claiming here, represent that I, myself, I put this thing to note the intended, the say use, I'm seeing the apple. I mean, by seeing or some form of relation. I'm not so interested in this thing as to remark in this thing. The apple. Option 4 would say, I am having the experience. I am having this experience. Okay? Here, option 1 is one that would claim that only the primary object of experience is represented. Okay? I was intending to show some phenomenological reasons to claim that also about myself, and then resisting the idea that the experience itself has to be represented. Okay? And by explaining what it takes to make this kind of the self-representation, and by analogy with what I have called the Hinge representation, I was trying to show what would be those of you say, no, I mean, I'm not convinced that it's subjective in this sense or that anything about myself is conveyed. And to show that it's something relatively weak, I show you the analogy with the location from which also has to be evaluated. Your perceptual experience definitely has to be evaluated. So that's not something controversial. So what I'm claiming is that the content of experience, something along these lines, the content, I don't want to say the content of experience. So the correctness conditions of the state would be expressed by something like this sentence. Does this help a little bit? In the case that Maria say, it's like, I would say, I am seeing, or let's assume that something like Sebasness enters the content of experience. If not, it's like this form, blah, blah, blah. I am seeing Sebas. So when all of you look at me from the very same position, your experience with regard to this feature, this phenomenological contribution would have a content something like that, like I am seeing Sebas, or I am seeing this form, this color. So it will depend on the properties that we let enter as playing the role of the primary object of experience, right? So we all, including me, when I'm looking, if I were to be able to look at myself from your position, I would be representing something like that. If you see me from the very same perspective, and you have all the very same kind of experience, okay, these indexical elements guarantee that there is a representation. The feature that is responsible for is something that is in common in your experiences, as illustrated by this fraction in the case of a kind.
Wants to make a question?
Yeah, I think it's a follow-up. It's a clarificatory question, maybe. Because sometimes it seems like you want to distinguish between different types of kinds of conscious states. Like the title indicates if there is one core or first-person representation, it seems there must be some others that are not core, but they're still count as conscious, and some others that maybe count as conscious, but they're not represented. I mean, so that was suggested sometimes. Some other times, it seemed to me that you want to include the self as represented in the experience, number 3 there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But then you said you want to be neutral without, I mean, between including it not including it. So that's the question. I mean, I think the question is why not, the proposal, why not accept that 1, 2, 3, and even 4 can be different modes of being conscious of a same. I mean,
okay, perfect.
because what it is to see unconsciously a red apple. Like this case is that you're not aware that the apple is there at all, or.
So let me see if I follow, because there are like a bunch of questions there. Yeah. So first one, by I mean core desert representation, what I intended to do, what I wanted to do is to distinguish the particular kind of desert representation that is required in the case of consciousness from other desert representations, okay? So like, for example, one in which is represented by an object, or one that might be considered, which is, or one as an object, or one that is conceptual. So I do have this representation, like I want to kill my father. That's an unconscious belief that I have, okay? But I believe this is a conceptual representation, so this is not the one. So by claiming this, what I wanted to do is to distinguish this form, the kind of the self representation I'm appealing to, from other forms of the self representation. So not some conscious states from other conscious states. And my claim, and let's see how far I can go, is that I want it to be a solution to what I have called the demarcation problem. I want something that is constitutively represented by all experience. That means something that all the experiences can represent. That's the only way to get a solution to the demarcation problem in the representational terms. It might be, well, Sebas, so here is, so maybe we have all those things, yeah, but then my attempt would fail. I mean, I still might have to say interesting things, but I think that's less interesting. And what I try to show is that all these first-person, this particular kind of first-person representation are conscious states. So then I need to require that this is constitutive of. So here, this is what I say. So it might perfectly be the case that some of our experience does this thing, okay? That's fine. But this is what they constitutively do. And this cannot be the case, and this cannot be the case. Whereas there is an interesting discussion on whether we have, I'm assuming, without giving the proper justification, that the primary object of experience is unconsciously represented. So there is an ongoing, the typical case that have been taken to favor that is the case of blind sight. So blind sight is people having an scotoma, so damage in B1, and they claim not to see anything. Nonetheless, they can track certain features. That seems to suggest that they have tracked some information. I'm actually convinced that there is good, that this empirical evidence can really be called into question, and Ian Phillips in Block have been discussing that very recently. So I'm just assuming that this is one thing. But on top of that, the phenomenological feature I'm calling the attention, and that's why we call it, is that experience are first personal. So the experience in general does not simply convey how the world is, but actually the relation that one brings. And that's, I think that this is the reason that we think of experience as paradigmatic cases of something being first personal. And if this is something that we intend to capture, because this is the project, I mean, somebody can take another project, is to capture that in representational terms, then we need to do something like that. So the first question had to do with whether there are different kinds, and I have just motivated why I want to do this thing. The second had to do whether it's because I wasn't clear enough, so I want something to be constitutive of all experience. And then it comes to the last point was related to whether the self is something represented or not represented. By represented, here's what I mean by represented, and I shouldn't be, it's because I want to be neutral on many different ways of speaking. So some people think that something is represented if it's part of the content. So, but when I say that something is represented, I mean that it's part of the correctness condition, so that the state has to be, something has to be evaluated relative to the subject. So if you like, so Sebas, so in my terms, Sebas if you take somebody like Perry, Sebas doesn't have to be represented. So I'm not claiming that the subject has to be represented. All that I'm saying is that the experience has to be evaluated with regard to the subject. So the subject is part of the correctness conditions or the circumstances of evaluation. And there is something in the state that makes it that it has to be evaluated. And this is something that can show in the phenomenology. So one thing is like, well, but if it's not something represented, how can it be show in the phenomenology? So Recanati, for example, thinks that if something is, so he thinks that in perception, we have what he calls implicit Desser representation. That is extremely close to what I'm claiming here, that is co-Desser representation. The reason why I choose a different name is because in his theory, it is consciousness the thing that guarantees that the state has to be evaluated with regard to the subject. But he claims, so here is the theory for those of you who are not familiar, extremely quickly, he says that some things can, despite of the fact that they are not part of the content, what is explicitly represented, can be part of the correctness conditions. And they can be part of the correctness condition without being part of the content, because they have to be evaluated with regard to this feature, and something guaranteed that they cannot be evaluated otherwise. And as it cannot be evaluated otherwise, there is no need for it to be part of the content. It's part of the mode of the mode of representation. And the mode, in the case of perception, is the experiential mode. So the experience, which is the mode in which we represent, the mode in which we represent in perception, guarantees that it cannot be evaluated otherwise. So I'm happy with most of those things. But then, first of all, this is not valid for my project, because in this project, consciousness is prior to the self-representation. I want to do the opposite. I want to explain consciousness in terms of the self-representation. But I hope that this example shows in what sense, in my terms, I say that but he agrees that what is part of the mode of representation can show in the phenomenology, and he insists in that. So all that I'm saying is that this is something, so the subject is represented by saying that the subject is represented, I'm saying that it's part of the correctness condition. There is no object. So it's not an object. It's like this form of representing that I'm expressing here that is captured by these minimal forms of the self-representation, the one that I'm looking into. This is what would be expressed by this sentence. So when I say that I am seeing Sebas, when we all represent that I am seeing Sebas, in all those cases, you yourself, each of you, is part of the correctness conditions, okay? But it does not require to represent. So does this help?
So in that sense, what it doesn't help is that your insistence in avoiding articulated constituents, because if there is no representation of the subject in the experience, then will be part of the architecture of the agent, so the agent will be part of the correctness conditions without being part of the.
So the reason why I don't want to commit myself to an unarticulated constituent is that it could be the case that there is nothing in the architecture, and that nonetheless the state has to be evaluated. I take that, and you can help me, and I take that to be the example that the Sealanders want to show. And that's why I say there has to be something in the state, something in the architecture. How do you think that is the most useful way to... It's clear what I try to do? And
I think, but I mean, one thing is not commit to the unarticulated constituents picture, the other one is to try to avoid. I mean, I thought you wanted to be neutral, so you don't say, well, your view doesn't seem incompatible.
No.
So we were too cautious in avoiding it.
No, what I want to do. Okay. So when something is, there are two senses, I think. So there are like two ways in which. So in the paper I deal with this, and I speak in terms of an unarticulated constituent when I consider the case of the. The question is whether an unarticulated constituent can be something. It can mean merely that is something that is part of the correctness conditions without being part of the content, but then the use of content there is already technical, because depending on the theory you have something. But the difference between being about and concerned does not perfectly match the view between articulated and unarticulated, and then an element is an unarticulated constituent. There can be that there is nothing in the cognitive system that makes it to be evaluable with regard to this feature, and I want it to there to be something. So I'm trying to, at least you understand what I'm trying to do and how I'm trying to spell out. So there are like a bunch of views, and I try to be neutral so that all the people that don't believe that can take my idea, but that has the risk.
You have much time, and we have a couple of questions. Aida?
Well, thank you for the talk. I'm not very familiar with this topic, but I was wondering. Okay, I understand that the self-representation has a role in your theory. That you have just explained, and that you don't wanna put in contrast with Recanati. I think you want to explain first representation and then consciousness, but I don't understand very well why do you want to commit to the representational view like so strongly? Because it seems to me that a sense of agency or something, a notion of this kind of self-awareness, something like this, and from a developmental point of view, in psychology, it has more sense to think that consciousness comes before representation, the self-representation, or
cool. There are a couple of things. There are a couple of interesting things in your comment. So, the reason why I want to do this way is because this is a way. It's like, because I have been all my life working in this shit, and it's like I have to continue doing. No, but that's not the real answer. So it's because I think that representationalism helps to understand consciousness. So you start by phenomenology, you take phenomenology as what the experience conveys, you unpack this idea of what is conveyed in representational terms, and you try to figure out what are the structures that are able to do that. This is the project. And this is I find it a promising project in the prospect of naturalizing consciousness, or understanding consciousness, or understanding at which point in the representational system consciousness arises. So it gives you, but then let's have a look to why these early representations do not have this kind of, are not this kind of representations, and when they become this kind of representation, you have a solution. So whether or not at the developmental point the self-representation comes first or later, here is something non-conceptual, so it's prior, it's independent of language development. So you cannot say, I'm not sure, I'm definitely not sure about that, and I have serious doubt, but I would have to give you a theory of what it takes from a system to have this kind of representation, these core desert representations, and then we could discuss that. In the absence, there is nothing. Here is something, so you perfectly point out to something very interesting, namely action and the sense of action. Peacock grounds the self-representation in this sense of action. But the sense of action is phenomenology, is a conscious state. So he's also, as Recanati does, grounding consciousness on action. But there is a further reason not to go via action. So as far as I know, it's not clear to me that you cannot distinguish action from mere movements without appealing to any kind of content. So you appeal to intentions, and intentions are, if they are representations, they are definitely the self-representations. So your intentions, it's that you yourself want to do this and that. So I would also go like grounding action, so the distinction between action and mere movements in the representations, or in first-person representation, at least in experience. If you have a theory of action, so for example, in the debate this debate that I mentioned, between Ian Phillips and Ned Block, what they do is they use Barth's notion of, it has to be a representation at the personal level, and they look for what distinguishes personal representation and subpersonal representation in action, and they cannot agree. And one thing that I'm working on is that there is no way that you can do this distinction by means of action, and when I try to do it is in terms of the self-representation for this distinction. But it's a way to go. All that I'm saying is not convincing, so to go is that saying some of the reasons that bring me to follow this route. I hope that this helps.
But we have time for 2 short questions. John first and Josu then, but short please.
Well, if someone, I can, excuse me, just a clarification. I thought that my question would be more peripheral, but it's coming to the point. And it's just a question about the self-requirements of your project. How far will do it? Because if I understand well, you are saying that, well, just the triggering ideas, the demarcation problem that you have presented us between conscious and unconscious states, and you are going to try how this representational view can help to make this distinction clear. And I'm aware that you, from the very beginning, have said that you acknowledge that the cases in which we are not dealing with perception are more difficult. And I don't want to put the thing on the back.
You can, I mean, I'm happy.
This is a question about, because as far as you have said that from the beginning, but as you have proceeded in explaining the project, I have been thinking that it was more and more difficult. I mean, this difficulty that you acknowledged from the beginning, from the explanations and your answers to some of the questions, sounding even more difficult. And my first question that would be, what for the project, if you would need to stick to your idea and make an effort and try to bring together those other cases that are not perceptual also to the representational explanation that you need, or you would be more flexible and accept, like I think that Kepa was proposing, that you can accept different ways, different forms of being conscious, and then some would really adapt to your representational description, but other could be different. And the second part of the question would be, because I explained why I have realized that it was more difficult as you proceeded your explanation, because again, if I'm right, you were saying that your theory goes beyond the experience of a primary object and something else. And you may have understood what is this relation, this I see. But it seems that this primary object is necessary all the time.
Yeah.
Even if you need something that goes beyond, but it's necessary. And this is what I'm seeing more, less and less clear in the cases.
Terrific. It's absolutely clear. It's so the primary object is required if we need a representation. If there has to be an object. Okay. So the question is, what is this object in other cases? So I'm going to give you one example of some of the tools that people are dealing with, and then see. So I was assuming that there is always a primary object of experience, and with that I intended to claim, because I'm figuring in these other features. So this, let's call it a structural feature of the representation, if you want it. That makes it first personal, okay? Because I want to call attention to the subjective or first personal object of experience as a constitutive feature of all experience. Now, take an example like I'm gonna say an example that is bad for my case, but not that bad. And then I give you a very bad example, which I think that I have no freaking idea how to do that, okay? So in the case of pain, for example, people like Colin Klein or Manolo Martinez, they're working in what is called imperative content. They are making use, so the kind of content that I'm using here is a content that tells you how the world is. Imperative content, but and are also very consistent with Millikan's views. So states also tell you what to do, how to act. So they act. So what your experience conveys, get out of this state, something like that. So and they use this form of these commands, these representational commands, to exactly. So I'm using also what is called indicative content, but there are more tools that can be used. So how to combine that? So that's a very starting. So we're talking about like 7 years research by some people interested in this field. All that I'm pointing out is to some. So how to do that with orgasms? Like, give me more of that. Is that enough? We will discuss it yesterday with after the class with a kind on tickles. How you do that with tickles? But think of moods. I mean, moods are phenomenally conscious experience, like being depressed. I think that Dretske at some point that this says something. I need to look for that. I wanted to look for that in the paper, and he says something. But those are like far more complicated cases. All that I'm offering is like one of these elements that there is, and why I use the primary object of experience, because for illustration, what I'm interested in is do we have a primary object of experience when we have a command? Well, the pain, so the damage, so if there is information about the damage would be like the primary object. So, and the damage is over there, so but things can get tricky. All that I'm doing is pointing out to some things that can be done to give hope rather than give you a solution. I don't have it.
But you would prefer fighting this and looking to put it together rather than accepting that there are different ways.
So it's like if the representationalist project is to succeed, it has to be captured in those terms. And I'm figuring out, so I think that this subjective, more importantly, this subjective aspect is something that I think that is representational. So the subjectivity, and that's what I'm interested in, but yeah, so I want something that makes a demarcation, so that distinguishes, like help contribute to tell us at which point, because especially if we think that availability to global control, something like the global workspace or the working memory, is not, so the things that you notice, so there might be experience that you have and you fail to notice, like elements that are here in the periphery, they contribute to your phenomenology, but you are not in a position to reply, you need to move the attention. If they contribute the attention before being there, then it's not being encoded in this global workspace or this working memory. And then, if we accept that there are unconscious representation, then it's like, what? So so like Bloch and Phillips, they're trying to appeal to the role they play in action, but then we need to get clear about what is the notion of action in play. I think that there is no acceptable notion of action with all the desiderata that they want, and I like doing this stuff.
Okay. We have just time for a last short question and a short answer.
Okay.
Just
Mine wasn't sure.
No, mine is maybe too basic. Is because your experiences are you say like states or no?
Yeah.
And you are always saying that the experience convey. All the time is convey.
Yeah.
You are saying conveying because you want to avoid. What you mean is the experiences contain information because you want to avoid. Do you want to be neutral concerning the content and this kind of stuff, or other way to phrase this is experiences. If you say that experiences that what you want to say by convey is that there is from the information you can extract from that event. What is conscious is the information that the individual picks up from that event among all information is available. I don't know if you...
Let me help you quickly reply, and then if not, I'll make an effort after so that they kind of... So, when I say that it's conveyed, take what is phenomenologically manifest, what is right before the eyes when you have in the experience, okay? That's what I'm saying, characterize that, and this is, it can be adequate or it cannot be adequate, right? So you can be hallucinating that. Mm-hmm. So this is what I mean by what the experience conveys. And some people, Susanna Siegel would call it the content of experience. But as I'm saying that something about oneself is conveyed, and it's not clear that I myself am part of the content, this will depend on what you mean by content and how you use content. I don't want to use content. But it's like what is phenomenologically manifest, what the experience says. We could also think of, maybe this helps, it's like, I like to think of the content of what the experience represents as what you are in a position to come to believe without inference, just by having the experience. this has some sort of complications, like for example, just by having the experience I can come to believe that there is an apple, but it's not clear that the property of being an apple is something that enters the content. And there is some discussion there, so I have to be careful and leave it as an intuitive but sufficiently valid way of presenting that, because I'm mostly focused on the fact that it's me, the one that is having the experience. So it doesn't say the kind of information is not third-person information. The kind of information that the experience gives you is not just third-person information, but first-personal one. That's what I intended to show.
Okay. You will continue clarifying our doubts during lunch, I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your questions.